ואת השם בזכות הצדיק רבי חיים פיתו הקדוש ברוך הוא bless the entire קהילה, entire קהל, ברכה והצלחה, and סייעתא דשמיא גדולה, and we will all come to a place of redemption, amen, כן ירצו ואת השם. So now, but this week's parasha is really one of the most important parashot in the Torah, and what's incredible that we don't often give it the credit for it. We usually look at the Parashat of Balak as another person that got up and fought Bnei Israel, as another story in the Torah that Bnei Israel need to go through at the time of leaving Egypt, without it having importance and without it having some sort of meaning in who we are as Bnei Israel. As we discussed this morning, we see in this week's Parashat something very, very unique. We know that the Torah, in its structure, is not always structured in a order of a timeline basis. And sometimes it is, such as the beginning of the Torah with Adam, Noah, Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, in some portions of the Torah. But in other portions, such as the book of Devarim, it's an entire book that was really one big speech of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu alav shalom repeated the Torah. We call it Mishnei Torah. It was like a reputation for Bnei Israel, being that it's not the same nation. In what sense? In the sense that we know the nation that left Egypt were not the nation that entered into Eretz Israel. That whole nation died in the desert. So in order to keep this new generation up to date, Moshe Rabbeinu alav shalom taught them the Torah once again. So if we look at the Torah, we find that not all the Torah is in a order of a time structure. Some parashat are, like we mentioned, with regards to stories, and other ones are not. What's more incredible is, like we mentioned this morning, the Torah does not talk and does not disclose what occurred throughout the whole 40 years of the desert. Zohar Kadosh said that the Torah and many of the Midrashim and the Chazal talks about only the first year of the desert and the last year of the desert. Where the first year, year number 1, and year number 40 were the only 2 years that we discuss what occurred. So, until Parashat Chukat of last week, all the stories, Yitro, Korach, the sending of the spies, all what we could imagine, were all parashot, were all portions that it was events that occurred on the first year that they were in the desert. And that hence this idea that the last parasha before Parashat Chukat, we have Shalach Lecha, which is the idea of sending the spies, that in that parasha we were punished to be in the desert for 40 years. With the original plan that we leave Egypt, we get the Torah a few months later, 49 days later, 50 days later, and immediately after we receive the Torah, we enter to Eretz Israel, which was supposed to be a 3-month process. Within that 3 months, Bnei Israel were sent the spies. Those spies saw the land, they fell, they sinned, and Hashem punished them that they will stay 40 years in the desert. And He extended their journey time. Because in reality, even if we look at the map, it's a very short distance. You can probably do it with a horse or with a car in 3-4 hours, or 3-4-5 hours. It's not a big distance from Egypt to the entrance of Eretz Israel. Especially that Eretz Israel was much larger at the time. So their journey was supposed to really take, even whether they were millions of people, just a few months of moving by foot, because they couldn't move millions of people. They didn't have millions of horses. So it was just supposed to be a short journey. Then HaKadosh Baruch Hu extended it. Until Parashat Chukat, we talk about the first year. Parashat Chukat, we start to talk about the last year. And that really brings us into this week's Parasha. Where this week's Parasha, we really prepare ourselves in the last days of Bnei Israel being in the desert. We just read Aaron HaKohen, last week's Parasha, passes away. Miriam passes away. And even Moshe Rabbeinu alav shalom is given a date when he will pass away soon. What is that date? In this week's parasha, the Torah says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu, you have one last request. You have one last job. And that is the job of what? The job of fight Balak, fight Bilam, fight Moab, which Moab was the nation of Balak and Bilam, destroy them at war, and then Bnei Israel would enter. Moshe gets praised with high praise that he actually ran quickly to do that fight. But the question really is why was it that the fight of Moab was really the barrier that it's as if Bnei Israel were waiting for that moment to be able to enter? Where until now we see that the journey is just a matter of time of travel. And suddenly we arrive to a story or an aspect of the Torah that's not about just passing 40 years, but rather, until you don't win this war, you can't enter. Until you can't fight this fight, you can't enter. Win Moab, be victorious at the battle with Moab, and then you could enter. Being that Moab was like the last check they needed to go through, or maybe the only check, because the only time that we mentioned that they have to do something to enter, in order to leave their state of the journey of the desert and to enter into Eretz HaKodesh. So the question really is, now that we look at this idea as a whole, why really was the entrance of Bnei Israel to Eretz Israel dependent on the fight of Moab? Why was that holding them back? And here we can start to understand why this week's parasha is a very, very important parasha, being that it what stands between Bnei Israel and entering their land. So the question is, why is that? Why was this so critical? So Zohar Kadosh says, and even the Mefarshim say, that Balak, he had a plan. His plan was to bring upon Bnei Israel destruction. We explained last night even that how did he try to bring the destruction through a curse, which was the opposite of bracha. I'm not going to get into it. We know that he chose Bil'am for a very specific reason. Being that the Midrash says that Bil'am was able to identify the moment of anger that HaKadosh Baruch Hu leads the world with. And what does that mean? Zohar Kadosh says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has two hands in which he leads the world. Chesed and Gvura. Chesed being kindness, love, etc. All the good things that could exist. Gvura being anger, judgment, accountability, strength, law, rules, etc. Zohar Kadosh says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in his being, Erachum Bechanun, he's a merciful God, he's a kind God. He doesn't want to be tough with us. We know that the Shlosh Midot, all his attributes are attributes of kindness. There is no concept of judgment. And we even established many times throughout our classes that Gvura, judgment from Hashem for the sake of judgment, doesn't exist. Rather, that judgment is always what? A preparation for kindness. Something to allow kindness to exist. Something to allow kindness to stay sweet. And how can we come to some sort of an example? Zohar Kadosh says that when there is only love and chesed, what tends to happen is that the individual, whether it's between a man and a woman, or a man and his boss, and a man and his father and son, a man and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, their relationship, in order for it to be preserved, you must have this concept of the balance of chesed and the balance of gvura. Where without this balance of both of these attributes, it doesn't last. How so? So the Zohar is something very simple. It's like a couple. They have only love, and they are crazy for one another, and they have such a passionate love and connection with one another. If they don't have fear of losing one another, or respect to respect that individual, being that if he doesn't respect or if she doesn't respect, they will no longer be together, or in other words, some sort of judgment and accountability, Zohar Kadosh says that love will never last. And not only that love will never last, but even though it's just pure love, that pure love will end up being the biggest betrayal to that individual that can possibly be. Where that love doesn't just stay love, but it grows into desires, into a lust, you can even call it. And you can give a simple example. It's like a couple. They love each other, but they don't respect each other. They have no fear to lose one another. They're going to end up doing shtuyot, doing mistakes, not being faithful to one another. They'll end up leaving one another, being for the fact that they have no fear of losing one another. What keeps ahava, love, together, and what keeps chiv'ah together is love, ahava, and the border of what? Of judgment. And that really goes back to our concept of judgment in the world doesn't exist. Judgment from Hashem for the sake of judgment, it's not something that is correct. It's not a reality. Rather, all judgment from Hashem is always a judgment that is created and brought to us in order to keep that love and bond with one another. And that is this concept of how HaKadosh Baruch Hu leads the world. Baal Shem Tov, and as well in the Baal Tanya, he says that in order to keep a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's like every relationship. Not just love is needed, but also respect and fear is critical to keep that relationship together. Well, if you have ahava for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you have love for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, only love, but you have zero fear from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that love won't last. And you'll end up sinning, and you'll end up falling, and you end up doing things that are not respectful to Hashem. Because it's not a love just to have love. The only way the relationship between a man and HaKadosh Baruch Hu could exist without falling into desires, to having that love turn into desires, is if there is fear, if there is respect, if there is accountability, if there is something that crosses a line where you lose that love. That's what preserves that love. Zohar Kadosh says that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu established in our world. 99% of the time, He leads the world with chesed. He leads the world with kindness. He influences the world with love, with mercy, with happiness, with goodness, with life. Or in other words, chesed, kindness. And then every day, for a split of a second, one moment, He throws in some judgment. He throws in some din, some gvura. Now we mentioned, gvura is never for the sake of gvura, if it's from Hashem, but rather it's for the sake of what? For preserving chesed. It's the respect and love and accountability that keeps a relationship together. So Zohar Kadosh says that one moment of anger that gets thrown to the world influences us with fear. It puts accountability. Our wrongdoings has a price for them. We get punished for any lines we passed with our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Like we mentioned, like with every relationship. If someone passes a line, I must have accountability. And that's how the relationship continues. That's how HaKadosh Baruch Hu structured the world. And that's how we are based. And in this manner, we are most likely to succeed and excel with our relation, with our growth with Hashem. Most of the day, love. One moment of the day, Hashem expresses judgment. And that judgment allows us to have fear from Hashem and have accountability to allow us to continue keeping that love and that bond thriving and growing. Zohar Kadosh says the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu expresses that judgment is what we perceive to be anger. And that's really the answer of what it says in this week's Parashat, that Bil'am understood the moment of anger of Hashem. Not that Hashem gets angry that someone made him upset, but rather that Hashem expresses that judgment in the world in order to influence fear, accountability, to keep people in check. Zohar Kadosh says that Bil'am knew that moment. And there's this entire teaching that says if you take a chicken, you tie its leg to the bed. There's a certain time in the day where his crown stands up, and when it stands up, you can tell when Hashem is angry. Zohar Kadosh says that once Hashem is angry, that's for that split moment, or in other words, He influences the world with some judgment. That judgment stands for what it is. In what manner? It's like if you come to someone that's quote unquote upset, and you tell him, you say, this man, that man, he did something not wrong, not good. How will that angry man, or that man that is leading us with judgment do? How will he react? He will say, that man did that. Punish him, hurt him, cut him off. I don't want to see him anymore. Like a father that is upset, that he's already upset, and his son comes and says, your other son did this. Don't support him anymore. I don't want to see him anymore. Or in other words, whatever gets brought to the father, whatever gets brought to the individual when he's leading himself with judgment, gets acted and gets led with that judgment, with that toughness. And that's this idea of blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. On Rosh Hashanah, we blow the shofar for a very simple reason. We blow the shofar where it says to confuse Yetzer Hara. We know that we say, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Marat Olam, Yom Ba'amid Mishpat, Kol Yitzurei Olam, Ki Banim Ki Ba'avadim. Today is the day of judgment. That's where Hashem judges all creations of the world. Being that it's the day of judgment, Yetzer Hara comes to Hashem when he's quote unquote leading with judgment like anger, and he tries to say, he sinned. And the evil inclination's hope is that if he will awaken a wrongdoing while Hashem is leading himself with anger and accountability and judgment, that Hashem will be tough and will be unmerciful and take that wrongdoing and pay its debt to the completion. We will pull the entirety of the debt in one shot. There is a price for wrongdoing. That price for wrongdoing is whatever amount of punishment or whatever it is, Hashem pays it off immediately. We blow the shofar to confuse the Satan. Or to not let the Satan finish his speech to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So it's like a man that's giving a speech. And you don't want him to say what he's doing, so you scream. And if you scream, what are you going to do? You're going to confuse him. He won't be able to continue his words, his sentence. That's what we do in Rosh Hashanah. We don't want the Satan to be able to say wrong, to say bad things. This one sinned, that one did this, that one did that. Being that whatever will be said in that moment will be brought to fruition. That's this idea of Balak and Bilam's plan. He came forward. He said, if Bilam knows when Hashem leads the world in judgment, being that Bilam was a prophet, and he had the Shema of Moshe Rabbeinu, the Shema of Hevel, the son of Adam Arishon, and he knew secrets of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's way of how he leads the world. Let's wait for the moment that he will be angry. And in that moment, he will curse Bnei Israel. And if he curses Bnei Israel in that moment, being that Hashem is angry, all what Bnei Israel did wrong, whether if it's the golden calf, whether if it's the fact that they didn't do Korban Pesach, which is a big chidush, whatever they would say, whatever Bilam would say, any wrongdoings of Bnei Israel, Hashem will punish them and act with the utmost of judgment, cruelty, and strength. Being that Hashem is, quote unquote, upset, furious, fuming, you can even call it. That's the aspects of judgment and gvura. That was the plan of Bilam. Zohar Kadosh says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, being that he saw mercy and he is the mercy of all, he knew that Bilam has that plan, and he knew that Bilam would try to use the structure of the world to bring punishment on Bnei Israel. What did HaKadosh Baruch Hu do? Rashi, the Mefarshim, and the Midrash, he said HaKadosh Baruch Hu acted with kindness. In what manner? In the manner that throughout all the years that Bilam was alive, and he was capable to know when Hashem was upset, throughout all those years, Hashem did not act with that one split second of anger. We completely eliminated, took out this concept of him being angry for one moment. Where throughout all those years of Bilam's wrath, of leadership as a prophet, Hashem never acted with even 1 second of anger. Why? As long as Hashem is not angry and doesn't bring judgment to the world, Bilam won't be able to curse. Bilam won't be able to bring destruction on Bnei Israel. That was the mercy of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that really brought us to a little beautiful idea of how Hashem even prevented throughout the entire journey of Bnei Israel anyone from saying anything bad. Such as, for example, the fact that we call the holiday of Yetziat Mitzrayim Pesach for the Korban Pesach, but in the Torah it calls it Matzot. In the Gemara and Masechet Pesachim it says, why do we call it Pesach and in the Torah called Chag HaMatzot? So it says because throughout the 40 years of them being in the desert, they didn't have sheep. So they couldn't do the Korban Pesach. So as long as they couldn't do the Korban Pesach, there is space for other nations to say, look, this nation or the nation of God, they're not even fulfilling the first mitzvah Hashem gave them. The mitzvah of Korban Pesach, the mitzvah that talks about their own Geulah. So we see HaKadosh Baruch Hu throughout this whole journey did everything to prevent anyone from being able to awaken judgment on Bnei Israel. Called it Chag HaMatzot. Being that they were able to do Matzot on Pesach, throughout in the desert. They couldn't do the sacrifices, they didn't have the cattle. They were able to do Matzot. So throughout the 40 years, they fulfilled the mitzvah like we do it today with wine and Matzot. So we see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, His mercy, extends to the highest levels of account. That He prevented Himself from acting with judgment all those years that Bilam was at wrath, just not to allow him to bring judgment and destruction upon Bnei Israel. That's where it comes to this week's Parashat, where Balak calls Bilam. He tells him, go curse them. Bilam waits. He's saying, okay, let's wait for the moment that Hashem is upset. And he's waiting. And he's waiting, and he's waiting. He tries to curse, blessing comes out. He tries to curse again, a blessing comes out. He realizes that Hashem is not acting with anger. And as long as he's not acting with anger, he can't curse. So, Bilam, he said, this doesn't work, it's not working. What did Bilam understand? He understood that maybe he cannot bring a curse upon Bnei Israel, meaning that Hashem is not angry, But maybe we can use the fact that there is no fear in the world. Like we mentioned, for all those 40 years, Hashem didn't act with judgment. Wherever there was no judgment, there was no fear. There was only love of Hashem. And we see Bnei Israel were acted with the utmost love of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But if there's only love, it's not enough. Bilam knew that being that Bnei Israel didn't have that fear to hold themselves back from sin because they would get punished, that he can cause them to sin with love, with ahava, with chesed. And if they were to sin with ahava and chesed, they would bring a curse on themselves. And that was the plan of Bilam. He took the woman of Moab. He told all the women of Moab, the woman of Moab, go. Bring Bnei Israel to a place of sin. Now they have no fear of God that will hold them back from sinning. Because they're all full of love, that love will turn into a lust, and that lust will turn into sin. Bilam understood that being that they lived at a generation of only love and peace, they could fall through love and peace. And that's what occurred. Bilam brought a destruction upon Bnei Israel. For what reason? He brought a destruction upon Bnei Israel just for the simple reason that they sinned themselves. And they didn't sin with hatred or with anger against Hashem. They sinned just because they didn't have fear of Hashem in that moment to hold them back for looking at these women and saying, these women are evil and they're not just kindful. It said that those women, they were taking perfume and they were giving out perfume. Those men, they said, how can I be upset at these women? They're so nice. And that's a teaching that I tell all the young people. Yetzer Hara, especially here in the Galut, doesn't fight you with a sword or with an enemy. There's no enemies here. There's no enemies to fight. He fights you with a smile. It's the woman that smiles to you in the universities or in all those places where the young are spending so much time. And that smile that causes love and kindness and goodness, that's the fight of Yetzer Hara. It's the same fight of Bilam. Bilam's fight repeats itself in every single generation, trying to make us fall, trying to bring upon us destruction, not through a war, not through judgment, or not through whatever it is, but rather through kindness and through love. And especially at times where we lack fear and accountability from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That was the plan of Bilam. But this idea brings us to even a deeper understanding of the journey of Bnei Israel in the desert. We see that Bnei Israel was supposed to enter immediately. They were supposed to leave Egypt and go straight to Eretz Israel. Right before they were supposed to enter, Hashem sent these spies. These spies were tzaddikim. They were holy, they were righteous. Why did they fall? How did they fall with such sin? How did they come to a place of talking bad about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of not being able to see them overcoming the natives? What made them do such bad things that caused them to go such a bad path down? So he said, maybe we can say that they fell because in Eretz Israel, there is Yetzer Hara, there is Yetzer Hara Tov, like in every land, there is a good inclination, there is a bad inclination. And they didn't have the fear of God that would stop them from sinning. Why? Because like we just mentioned, Hashem was kindful, didn't act with anger. And because they didn't act with anger, when they were introduced to a sin, they didn't have the ability to hold themselves back. There was no fear or accountability to prevent them from going down a bad path. Maybe we could say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu saw that if the spies were unable to hold themselves back in a world that there is no judgment being influenced in the world, that they were tzaddikim, they were head of tribes, how would Bnei Israel do that? How can Bnei Israel enter into a land and deal with evil inclination and overcome evil inclination when HaKadosh Baruch Hu couldn't act with judgment for many, many years? Why couldn't he act with judgment?
Bilam?
Because Bilam was alive. And as long that Bilam is alive, he's able to curse and he knows when Hashem is upset. Hashem can't be upset. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to himself, he says, if I send Bnei Israel to Eretz Israel or into any land, I send them to any inhabitants where there are people and there is women and there is inclination, there are different nations, and there is Jewish and non-Jewish, they will fall apart. They won't be able to withstand the lust and the desires of material and physical and all those things. Maybe we can HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to himself, I can't send Bnei Israel to Eretz Israel when there's no judgment and accountability, being that Hashem was acting with only kindness. But on the other side, I can't bring accountability to the world as long as Bilam is alive. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu did a punishment. What was the punishment? HaKadosh Baruch Hu took Bnei Israel and he told them, I'm going to send you your journey 40 years long. Why 40 years, you ask? What's this idea of 40 years? Why so long? Maybe we can say that was the years that was necessary for Bilam to live his life, quote unquote, to come to the end of his days. And when he will come to the end of his days, Bnei Israel could get up, leave that bubble that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created them of goodness, like the clouds, the food. In the desert, they didn't have evil inclination. There was nothing to do evil. They were amongst themselves. There was no bad. There was no good and bad. There was no evil. They just lived in a perfect world. Maybe we get to Hashem said, I'll send them to the desert, drag out their journey 40 years. Throughout those 40 years, I can influence the world with only good. That they don't have opportunity to sin even. They didn't really have freedom. They had only good. There wasn't freedom when there's only good. But as a result of that, I can let Bilam live his life. And when Bilam comes to the end of his days, and Bilam starts to do mistakes, and Bilam loses his direction, when he loses the right path, and he creates debt of punishment, the end of Bilam's life will come. And once the end of Bilam's life will occur, only then Bnei Israel could enter into the land once I will start influencing the world with judgment. And that's why throughout the whole journey, it says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu sent Bnei Israel in complete zigzags. Why? Just to not let them be amongst other nations. It says, V'lo nacham Elohim der Eretz Pelishtim. Hashem didn't even want Bnei Israel to walk near other nations. Why? Maybe we can say it's for the simple reason that he knew that there was no judgment, there was no fear of God, that he couldn't act with fear. So Hashem made them go around turns just to not have any contact with anybody, to be in a secluded circle. But this week's parasha, Bilam does a mistake. And his mistake that he makes, Bnei Israel sin. And once he did a mistake of making Bnei Israel sin, we know there are sins, Ya'areg v'lo ya'avo. A person dies and he does not commit them. And one of them is improper relations. Once Bilam brought sin to the world on himself, death of end of his life was brought. And at this point, once Bilam leaves this world and no longer is alive, only then what? Bnei Israel can enter into the land. And here Moshe gets called. Hashem tells him, Moshe, you have one last journey. You lived 40 years in the desert. I dragged you 40 years in the desert to keep Bnei Israel occupied. But now that's it. You have one more thing to do. Finish this. It takes you 1 year. It takes you another 100 years. Finish this and only then you could enter. What was that? The war of Moab. Fight the war of Moab. Kill Bilam. Kill Balak. There's no more fear of cursing Bnei Israel. And then we can go back to a normal world. Zohar Kadosh says, Moshe ran, fought Moab, fought Bilam. It says that Bilam flew in the air. He did witchcraft and flew in the air, and they had to pull him down, and it was a balagan to kill him. Once they killed him, it says Moshe Rabbeinu was called, and the HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, your tafkid, your job, your purpose in the world is no longer needed. And that's why we said that Moshe was even buried in Moab. He was buried on the battlefield where they fought Moab. The moment Moshe Rabbeinu alav hashalom passed away, he says, the clouds disappeared, the man stopped falling, the kindness was no longer present, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu started to influence the world in the manner of 99% chesed and 1% of judgment. And that 1% of judgment would allow them to have an even playing field to enter into the land and have the fear and accountability for not sinning. This really, Abotai, is a big lesson for our entire life. In life, we can't act with just kindness. The same way we can't act with just judgment. But it's easier to think that not acting with pure judgment is proper, but while acting with pure kindness is proper. We learn from this that in every part of our life, we must have boundaries. We must have accountability. We must put lines that we don't cross. We must have fear from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We must have fear from doing wrong. And that is the only thing that will allow our relationship with Hashem to grow. Allow our bracha to grow. Allow our simcha to grow. Accountability and structure. And that's what we really learn about the Next Parasha. Last step of Bnei Yisrael's journey in the desert was always what? Was bringing their world to a place in which they have the balance of chesed, of kindness, of being soft, being loving, but understanding that there must be boundaries and lines that we all must follow, being that there is a price for our good deeds, amazing rewards for them, but also, Chatz v'Shalom, there is a price for our wrong deeds. And that's what allows us to live meaningful lives of success and achievement. So may we all, Hashem, succeed in this mission and come to a place of big Yeshuat and Brachot.
Amen.